this morning. So some of you undoubtedly are familiar with the situation that's been playing out at Hamline University in St. Paul over the last several months. But if you're not, I want to just go over that situation, bring everybody up to speed, and then have some reflections based upon it. So last fall, Hamline University contracted with Dr. Erica Lopez-Prater, an art historian, who also happens to be a 2003 graduate of Luther College, to teach as an adjunct an art history class on world art. Dr. Lopez-Prater told the students in the beginning of the semester that the class would involve looking at artistic images of religious figures like Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, and the Buddha. Now, recognizing that there were some Muslim students in the class, and recognizing that at least some Muslims feel that images of Muhammad are something that are forbidden within the Islamic tradition, she warned the class about this, that they would be looking at some of these images, and told the students that if they, she would warn them before showing these images, and if they found them objectionable, they could leave the class without any penalty. So in October, she wanted to show an image, and did show an image, of a famous 14th century painting by a Muslim artist for a Muslim audience of the Prophet Muhammad receiving revelations from the angel Gabriel. Again, before showing the image, she warned the class. None of the students opted out. Everybody stayed in the class and viewed the images. After the class, a Muslim student came to Dr. Lopez-Prater and complained about the fact that she had shown this image, feeling that from her perspective, the Islamic tradition forbids the looking at, or creating and looking at images of the Prophet. To which Dr. Lopez-Prater tried to explain to her the pedagogical reasons for showing the image, and trying to show sensitivity to the students' religious sensibilities. But apparently this did not satisfy the student, so she went to the chief diversity officer of Hamline and complained to him. And he sent an email, not mentioning Dr. Lopez-Prater by name, but an email to the entire Hamline community, emphasizing the importance of being sensitive to people's religious differences and sensibilities. This then led to a community convocation where the community came together to discuss the issue, and it very quickly became clear that this was all coming from a situation in Dr. Lopez-Prater's art history class. And so she became the center of this controversy, which eventually led the university to withdraw what had previously been a verbal agreement to hire her again for the spring semester, and calling her decision to show this painting, this famous painting of Muhammad, an example of Islamophobia. Now, whatever you think about the decisions of the Hamline administration, and Dr. Lopez-Prater is now suing them, so they've created some real problems for themselves. The situation and their reaction to it, I think at one level is at least somewhat understandable. Islamophobia is a real thing. It's a real thing in our society. There are people who make their money trying to stoke Islamophobic hatred for Muslims. And images of the Prophet Muhammad have become part of that over recent years, when we've seen controversy over the Danish cartoons of Muhammad and the Charlie Hebdo affair in Paris, where groups were drawing cartoons of Muhammad intentionally to be insulting and to stir up Muslim reaction. So in that situation, Hamline wanted to be, I think, what we might call Islamophilic. They wanted to support this student and her objections to what was going on and her religious sensibilities. And I think that's understandable. But in rushing to her aid and completely ignoring Dr. Lopez-Prater's rights as a faculty member, they may have unintentionally reinforced a dangerous, harmful Islamophobic stereotype in their attempt to be Islamophilic. One of the stereotypes that Islamophobic groups use is to try to essentialize Islam, view it as all one thing, and as if all Muslims believe and do the same things. And by doing this, they can paint Islam with a broad brush and try to convince people that all Muslims are anti-Western terrorists who want to take over the world with Sharia law. That's what we see in the media. And so by essentializing Islam, they're able to create just this one unified Islam. And it seems to me that the administration of Hamline University fell into that trap themselves. By allowing this Muslim student to speak for all Islam, they bought into it. The way they seem to be framing it is that Islam forbids the creation and viewing of images. A little bit of religious literacy would have saved them a lot of trouble. Basic religious literacy. Because Islam doesn't exist. There's no Islam out there that can forbid anything. All that exists in the world are Muslims, people who identify themselves as part of the Islamic tradition. Now, a better way to frame this than instead of saying Islam forbids, is to say many Muslims believe that Islam forbids images of Muhammad. And then that opens up the conversation. Well, if many Muslims believe that, that means that not all Muslims do. And clearly, this artist in the 14th century did not believe that, or the audience for this painting did not believe that. And so it opens the door to viewing the Islamic tradition as a tradition that is full of diverse opinions and practices, and not all one thing. So I would like to spend some time this morning sharing with you a number of examples of diversity within the Islamic tradition. These are voices that we often don't see or hear, or if we do, they're not associated with this thing called Islam, at least in our public discourse. So one of the images that we often see related to Islam, when people hear of Islam and talk about it in the media particularly, is we see Middle Eastern terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda or groups like the Taliban in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And that becomes kind of our image of what Islam is. The problem is that there's also Malala Yousafzai, the young Pakistani girl shot in the head by the Taliban, who went on to win the Nobel because she was advocating for the rights of women and girls to be educated. And she went on to win the Nobel Peace Prize at the age of 17 in 2014. Now, as much as we might like to, if not admit it, the Taliban are a valid expression of Islam. Their views are based in their interpretation of sources. But so is the case for Malala. Her education activism for women and girls is just as much rooted in her understanding of the Islamic sources as the Taliban. She speaks for Islam too. Another image that we often see associated with Islam, particularly here in America, is the Iranian regime. Since the revolution in 1979, promoted by Ayatollah Khomeini, and the hostage crisis, and continuance of this regime in Iran that oppresses people and a number of human rights violations that they've been authors of. We view that in the West here as Islam, and we see Islam as being a problem What we don't think about is that all of those people we've seen over the last few months protesting in the streets in Iran, they're Muslims too. As is Shirin Ebadi, the 2003 Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Iranian lawyer who has spent 20 years fighting against the human rights abuses of the Iranian regime. At great personal cost to herself. She is a Muslim too. She is just as motivated by Islam in her activism against on the side of human rights as the Iranian regime is motivated by Islam in their activities. But we tend not to think about it in those ways. But we need to. Islam is diverse. Another stereotype about Islam here in the West is that Islam is inherently patriarchal and misogynistic. And there is some evidence to back that up. There are places in the Muslim world where, under the guise of Islam, we see things like honor killings, female genital mutilation, and other oppressive practices of women, denying them education, and those kinds of things. But then there's also Amina Wadud. We're not familiar with Amina Wadud. She's an African-American woman who grew up as a Methodist and then converted to Islam as a teenager. She ended up getting a PhD in Islamic studies from the University of Pennsylvania. And then in 1994, she published a famous book called Quran and Woman, in which she took upon herself the authority not usually afforded to women in the Islamic tradition to go verse by verse through the Quran and interpret the Quran as a book that supports gender egalitarianism. Twice in her career, Amina Wadud has also challenged gender stereotypes within by once in South Africa at Cape Town and once in New York City, leading prayers in mosque, something that women normally do. Amina Wadud's whole career has been about gender activism within Islam. And it is just as rooted in her faith and belief in the Islamic tradition as are those who would engage in misogynistic practices. She represents Islam too. Now, another one of these stereotypical images associated with Islam is the term jihad. Jihad viewed as kind of a holy war. People who want to come and destroy the West and take over the world through violence. But then there's Imam Ibrahim Saidi. Imam Saidi is a Nigerian Muslim who moved to Norway and has become Imam of the Darussalam Islamic Center in Oslo. In 2015, Imam Saidi went to Paris, where he spoke at the famous Paris Climate Summit. And in his talk, he interpreted jihad as the struggle against climate change. Imam Saidi's climate activism around this concept of jihad, so vilified in the West, has just as much right to be viewed as a representation of Islam as those who might be on the other side. And then finally, one of the unfortunate aspects of contemporary Islam is that Muslims have tended to be kind of late to the game when it comes to LGBTQ plus rights. There are still very strong strains of homophobia within the lives of many Muslims, but not all. Imam Dai Abdullah is credited with being the first imam of an openly gay-friendly mosque in Washington, D.C. Opened in 2011, the Light of Reform Mosque, believed to be the first openly gay-friendly mosque in the world. There are others since then. That was the first. Again, just as with the other examples, Imam Abdullah's activism around LGBTQ rights is just as much motivated by his Islamic faith as are those who are motivated in a more homophobic perspective. There is tremendous diversity in Islam. Islam is never one thing. There is no Islam in the world. There's just Muslims. And they believe different things on almost every issue. So Islam is a diverse tradition full of robust internal debates about many, many issues. Some Muslims certainly believe that images of Muhammad are forbidden in Islam. But other Muslims themselves have painted these very images for Muslims. We do well to remind ourselves of this rich diversity whenever we hear the term Islam. Thank you.
Would you, if there are any questions, we have just a few minutes. So if anybody has a question they'd like to make or comment.
This is more specific about the incident at Hamline. Did the student who was upset express any more detail about why she hadn't talked to the professor before, or was this in an effort to bring attention to the issue, or do we know any more about that?
Yeah. I don't know. I've not heard anything about that. What I understand is her concern wasn't so much, I mean, she didn't necessarily want to see the images, but then she did stay in the class and wanted to see them. But her complaint was more about the fact that Professor Wilbur's grader would show these images to anybody. She didn't want anybody to see these images. So it was the whole idea of even showing images like this.
You might talk about the many divergent Christian sects.
Yeah, Islam is just like any other what we call religious tradition. It's full of tremendous amounts of diversity. Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism. I mean, you have the Dalai Lama, you know, the Apostle of Peace, and you have Buddhists that have been trying to wipe out the Muslim minority in Myanmar for years now. So that diversity is characteristic of all of these traditions, because these traditions are just about the people that are part of the tradition, and nobody believes everything the same. And it's always harmful to sort of try to make individual people representations, this abstract notion of this. We do it all the time. So, and I think the Hamline administration unintentionally fell into that, created a lot of unnecessary problems for themselves by doing that.
Thank you, Bob.